In this module, we're going to look at trim details on our townhouses, spend quite a bit of time in that. And for us as model makers in this course, it's really around sweeps, the concept of making sweeps. And so a couple of things to keep in mind going forward as designers, that the trim work that we create is really revealed in the play of light and shadow. So if you look over at our bump outs that we're going to create on our townhouses, you can see that what's really reading from the distance is the shadow and the highlight that's created from the sunlight hitting and then creating a shadow underneath. And I think that's both really well expressed in this other image that I have here on the right of a trim, and the sunlight is striking the surface and creating those nice shadow details and highlight details. Another thing to keep in mind with trim is that its shape sometimes is not revealed until you actually miter it or bend it around a corner. If you were to think in the center field here, it's really hard to determine what the shapes are of the components that you're building. And it's only when you're mitering them or putting them at 90 degrees to each other in a corner condition like this that you can actually see what the shapes actually look like. So if you're not doing a lot of that, it might be unimportant to have very complex shapes. That's not to discourage you from using those shapes, but just to help you balance where you add value and complexity. So here's an example of simplicity in trim. There's no curvy trims in it. It's all flat work, meets with the style of the architecture, and in this case, a little more complex than what we're creating, but still to the same effect with square materials. And that's not to say curvy materials, curved shapes, coves, all of those things don't have their places. These are some examples where they match the architectural style. This green one, though, happens to be that early townhouse model that I created and eventually abandoned. But you might be wondering how some of these shapes are actually created, and this is kind of a little bit of a mock-up on how some of those shapes might be built up. So we have some trim work that has fancy shapes to it or curvilinear shapes to it, attached and constructed with some straight boards, a frieze board that would go on the face of the building. If you look down here in the corner, that's a rabbet. That means a cutout that will sit over the top clapboards that will be on the building. Those in the circle here, there's some kind of construction details that are kind of interesting. It's a little bit of the extension of the fascia board here, if that's what you could call it, to create what's called a drip edge. And that's a way to help prevent water from getting back into this joinery. But just gives you a good illustration of this idea how this kind of trim work is built up. And we've been doing this forever. Once again, this is just some historic built-up shapes. In this case, it's even with an integrated gutter system in the construction of it. Hopefully this will start to make you sensitive, going through the project, the module, make you sensitive to the idea of how trim affects both the style of the architecture and the visual interest of it. So here we have, a house that you may not normally pay attention to the details, but once we've gone through the module and looking at trim, you might then start to spot ideas where the frieze board up here is constructed with a couple of different levels of boards. The little bump out of the extra roof return, the detailing at the heads of columns, even these pilasters or these railings, and the ornamentation over the windows. So we're not going to be doing this, but I just want you to be aware that these are all based on the concepts primarily about sweeps that we will use in our modeling, and plenty of time for you to experiment going forward with them. A couple of specific terms, actually one specific term that I introduce in the townhouse module, and that's the idea of a water table. A water table could be thought of as a transition between the exterior wall and the foundation system, usually happening at that first floor level. Sometimes it's decorative and sometimes it has a functional reason for existing. In the case of our project, it is more, well, it actually is both, I guess, if you think about it. But here we have a wall system coming down, a water table board designed to drive the water away from the foundation edge that is down below it. and it creates a nice separation between the materials. So in this case, we have a brick facade transitioning to a stone facade, and we have in place here a water table or a trim material at that transition. I'll pick up on the in-class project next.